Greetings and welcome to the lecture on social justice and social welfare policy. This is chapter 3 in the textbook. What we're going to look at is just some statistics, really, mainly to look at who is at risk and what type of social welfare policy has been developed over the years and is still being developed. There is a discussion board post that is associated with this, so please, it's in the same folder. Please answer the questions as it regards to social work and social justice and social welfare policy. Some important things to know is that 1 in 6 children live in poverty in the U.S. 1 in 3 Americans are members of ethnic or minority groups. Minority groups are shifting in society. And so a minority group is that which has less population or less members of the population. So the split is really changing with Hispanics becoming the majority and then Caucasians and African Americans, Asians, and other ethnic groups becoming the minorities. Persons with disabilities are denied access to resources when the definition of disability changes. And we look at that as far as being the Americans with Disabilities Act, another type of social changes and laws that are enacted to protect those who are at risk for being discriminated against. We have LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons are excluded from accepted social norms and benefits, and also are seen as a part of the population that needs to be protected from discrimination. There are global and social and economic justice, and this is going to be a brief history of how things began to come about. In 1948, the UN had a universal declaration of what human rights should be seen as. When you watch the news or when you hear news organizations talk about a blatant disregard for human rights in some third world countries as well as larger countries like China and previously USSR, whenever Russia was a Soviet republic, which were seen to have major human rights violations. But Article 1 of the UN UDHR is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 25 says everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, which we know that in some countries and some parts of the world that they do not have the ability to live to that standard. And that's what we're going to talk about here with the economic injustice and how in some countries there are limits on vocational aspirations, not an effective training, not an ability financially to attend college, which prevents effective and appropriate parenting, or economic economic injustice would prevent parents from being able to send their children to college, or would mean that parents would have to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs in order to just afford ends meet, and that causes a strain on their ability to be parenting because they're not home as much. They don't have as much accessibility for their children. Contributes to a sense of helplessness and devaluation when someone doesn't have an ability to afford basic needs. This is not talking about wants, but basic needs, and it does put a strain on their ability to meet certain needs of their family and themselves. Limits access to safe and stable housing, limits access to food and nutrition, limits access to effective health and mental health care, and limits transportation and mobility. And the reason I read these last 4 together is basically in America, the American dream has always been to have a nice home and to have a good vehicle since the 50s, and to own a nice home as part of the American dream. And then within that, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these basic food, shelter, and other well-being issues are just basic rights, basic needs of human beings. So what is poverty? Poverty line is equals 3 times a 1960 basic food budget. And what we're going to look at with the poverty level is that if there is a level that you can look at of what the basis median income, which is the middle class. The middle class, upper class is your 1%. Middle class is seen as being the majority of Americans, and then those who are below the poverty line. Poverty line is you take the budget, basic food budget of 1960s, and times it times 3, and that'll tell you what the poverty line is. Anything below that line is considered poverty. We'll talk about that more in class. Today's basic food budget accounts for approximately 20% of the necessary household costs. The poverty line is set lower for the elderly because there's not enough income to basic their household needs because they're on a fixed income and may not have enough money to pay their taxes, fuel costs, and then just be able to afford health, medicines, and other costs. So a good definition here at the bottom is poverty is not having enough income to cover your basic household needs. Basically paying your rent, electricity, or even sometimes not being able to pay those, but paying the basic items and not having any money left over. Discrimination. Discrimination can be viewed as groups with less power. People with less economic, political, social power are vulnerable to discrimination and oppression or exclusion from the move or shift of power. Of course, we have a two-party system majorly in the United States, and a lot of time your libertarians or even your other organizations like your Tea Party, your small organizations may feel like that they are discriminated against because they don't have a voice within the major political system. And we'll look at that again more when we talk about social policy further on in the slideshow today. The dominant culture policies have included practices designed to exterminate lower power groups, for example, with Hitler and his views on extermination of the Jews, the extermination and annihilation of Native Americans in the United States, and then a lot of viewpoints towards those who are disabled who in the past. And this is where we're talking about what things were like and how social welfare and justice policies came about, and the reason was because of these things. There's still a major issue in the Native American populations with substance abuse. Some of the highest numbers of alcoholism are found in tribal counties, and then also we still see a lot of anti-Zionist views towards the Jewish culture. And with the laws that are enacted in the United States, you see less discrimination against those who have a disability. There's a lot of awareness that goes on, but it's still there. It's just with the amount of awareness and the laws in place, it's not as much as it once was, and that can be attributed to social welfare and social work. Dominant culture policies have included practices to isolate, segregate lower power groups. African Americans were segregated, Native Americans, mentally ill, and Japanese. During the World War II, there were camps where Japanese were put aside and isolated, segregated camps. Of course, we know about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which saw an end to segregation for African Americans. There's still a way to describe segregation with Native Americans because they do have reservations where their culture can still practice most of their rituals, religious rituals, and other type of activities, but that is a chosen segregation because they do have the ability to come off of those reservations if they choose to. Practices and policies designed for powerful groups to retain power and control, and that is when one group has the majority of the power and discriminates against others in order. The key here is one group is trying to hold on to their power, and when it should be shared across all types of groups, all races, all groups, all person types, including those with disabilities or those with mental impairments. These are the isms. You can look at different types of isms and the way that they're described. Racism is defined as that someone who or somehow where someone discriminates against those from a non-dominant racial or ethnic group or against a certain race. Sexism is discriminate against women. Ageism is discriminate against the elderly, and then homophobia is fear of and discriminate against those who are homosexual or choose an alternative lifestyle. The strengths and abilities of an individual are deemed irrelevant due to their identification with a low peer group. I've always heard in documentaries and such that someone who is a homosexual and African American would say that they have to deal with several of these things here. So if you talk about someone who is an elderly woman, a lesbian, African American, then they would meet all four of these areas of discrimination. The response to social injustice is someone has values in place. The values will help them to associate and bring about policy, and policy will help for there to be an offering of benefits and services in the community. Approaches to social work, there is residual, which is on a family level where families take care of their own. Employment is imperative. Access to social welfare services only when all else has failed. Resources are available temporarily to resolve the emergency, and we see that with emergency food stamps through TANF and other state agencies, housing costs. These are the small short-term helps. We have institutional. Society supports those in need. Social welfare services are available to prevent problems, and the use of services is normal and acceptable. This is when we talk about the Workforce Commission and other institutional agencies that are in place to help those in need for work. We have WIC, we have other programs that are designed to help those in need, and they're always there for anyone to take advantage of if they come into a place of need. Some historical influences on social welfare. In 1601, England, the poor had to be controlled. It was massive poverty in England. In 1776, the U.S. state governments were responsible for assisting. They had the choice if they wanted to or they didn't, the poor. And then policymakers believed that new natural forces existed to manage the poor, and basically that those who were poor would die from disease, or actually people in the 17 to 1800s would family would take care of them. They would die of illness or other type of situations would self-correct those issues. From 1865 to 1872, the education and support of former slaves was a brief federal responsibility in order to help with placement and have some type of management of those who were formerly slaves and needed, of course in the North now these programs were already in place to help former slaves to be able to be placed into employment and also to be able to start purchasing land. In the South it was slower, but eventually came about. From 1877 to 1900, social work emerges to assist the poor. And so what we see is this evolution of social work emerging to assist the poor and to make sure that services are there and available. We see 1935, and of course we had World War I, and then the Great Depression, and then in 1935 social insurance benefits for those who pay taxes in the event of disability or death. Public assistance benefits for those who met a specific definition of need, and then health and welfare services, health care benefits, and food assistance for eligible recipients. And this is your Social Security Act enabled all of these benefits for people who lost a limb at work, wasn't able to work anymore, people with permanent disabilities, and you see all these people who get Social Security benefits children of people who died in the line of work. All of these benefits are Social Security benefits that came from this act in 1935. Of course, TANF and AFDC TANF funds are block granted to states. Immigrants were not eligible. Families are limited to a maximum of 5 years of assistance. Parents with children 24 months plus are required to seek employment. And then AFDC or ADFC aid for families is income eligible families with children were entitled. All U.S. citizens were eligible. No time limits for or family size restrictions. Parents with children 3 years plus were encouraged to work. So this is what we would say was welfare. It's changed over the years, and the money is generated and then given to states to use for different programs. We have still food stamps and other types of programs in the state of Texas that are officiated or that are organized by the Department of State Health Services or CPS or other types of programs, organizations within the state government that see to making sure that those who are in need have access to those programs. What we look at here, closing up on today's slides, is values equals policies. Current values, anti-immigration. There's a lot of talk in the news and such about a need for immigration reform. And it's we're not going to get into that politics of that in this class. It's just whichever side that you're on, it's something that is relevant in today's society. Pro-work outside the home, pro-private contracting and competition, and pro-faith-based service provision. This was more under the George Bush era. It was a faith-based initiative that he came about as a way to streamline government funding and funds, and to try and close down a lot of social organizations that were government run or government funded, and then put those monies into churches or other charitable faith organizations in order for them to be in the community and bridge that gap. And the values, and what this means is society values, the things that are going on in society, and then how those things in society will equal to policies to help to work towards meeting the needs of values. And so policies in place are poverty definition, making sure that research is done to find out where the poverty level is currently. Minimum wage is something that's always a controversy about it being too low, and the need for, as inflation, as the cost of goods rise, so should the minimum wage. Of course, as we'll learn later in this class, it's always uneven. Usually inflation is growing exponentially while the minimum wage stays much lower. Affirmative action, which was a policy in place to help make sure that there was not discrimination in hiring practices. Tax incentives, which are there in place to help the economy to grow. Lack of national health care, which is something that our current president has worked towards, to making sure that there's affordable health care. And then the work towards less of a cumbersome application process to apply for and maintain health insurance. Global social justice, U.S. versus 50 prosperous nations. The way that you can look at this is that the U.S. has strengths in military spending and technology, private business profits and individual wealth, and health technology. The U.S. deficits is living standards of the poor compared to the wealthy. Such a huge divide between the wealthiest 1% and then the rest of society. Children living in poverty is a deficit. Low birth weight and infant mortality and keeping children safe from gun violence are seen as deficits where there could be a place of growth as it relates to us compared to other countries. In closing, social work, commitment to social justice at the National Association of Social Workers 2005 Congress. They came up with these 5 bullet points on their commitment as the collective social workers to come up with this. Number one is to advocate for universal health care, which you can see that came about with our current president. Promote human rights for all. Engage in politics, public policy, and social action. Confront institutional racism and impact the influence of corporate and political power at all levels. So there's a lot going on in the realm of social work as it relates to the social justice and welfare policy, and you're going to see a lot of this at play in your volunteer sites throughout the semester. We'll review some of this more in class as we prepare for our first exam.